of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. Banega Swasth India, and we are at the Bank of Baroda Mughal tent. Jaipur Literature Festival is now on Koo app. Please follow us for all festival updates. We are delighted to introduce Translations, Carry Across, Over and Beyond. This session is part of the JCB Prize for Literature series. Translation is a craft. What draws a translator to a book or the work of an author? How do you, linguistics, shape expression and adaptations? Nandakumar K and Fathima E.V, translators of M. Mukundan's JCB Prize winning Delhi, the city and its people, and Ministry S, translator of V.J. James' Anti-Clock, discuss the task of translation and the cultural, geographical, and sentimental attachments that frame it. We welcome all four of you. Ministry S is an IS officer working in Uttar Pradesh cadre who translates between 3 languages, Malayalam, English, and Hindi. Nandakumar K started his career as a sub-editor at Financial Express after doing his master's degree in economics, followed by a stint in international marketing and general management in India and abroad. Fathima E.V is the co-translator along with Nandakumar of M. Mukundan's Delhi, which was awarded the JCB Prize for Literature 2021. Arundhathi is a leading Indian poet and the award-winning author of 13 books of poetry and prose. Most recently, the poetry volume, Love Without a Story, and a book of conversations with female sacred travelers, women who were only themselves. All 4 of them will be signing their books after the session. Please grab your copies. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to welcome all of you to this session. Can I be heard? Yes? Okay. So I'm delighted to be here in conversation with 3 very accomplished translators. We have Fatima and Nandakumar, who are translators of Mukundan's powerful, epic novel that many of you have heard of, some of you have read. It's, as she points out, the JCB Prize-winning novel. It's this expansive sweep that covers, that is actually an anthem to that great battered old city of Delhi. And it's mapped through the eyes of its various immigrants, the Malayali immigrants and others. And it covers a period that is a particularly turbulent period in the country's history, the second half of the 20th century, from the Indochina War to the Indo-Pak Wars to the emergency, right to the Sikh riots, anti-Sikh riots. It's, above all, I think what touched me about it is that it is essentially something we can all identify with deeply, which is the very subtle, very unnameable process by which a place becomes home. And that, for me, touched a deep chord. And we also have with us Ministhy, who is the translator of this exciting, inventive, quirky novel, Anti-Clock, by V.J. James. It's also a prize-winning novel. It's won the O.V. Vijayan Prize. And it is an exciting, wildly innovative novel. It's an exploration of many themes, a reflection on time, on loss, on life, on death. But it is also a book that's memorable for its very quirky cast of characters, from this coffin maker to this rich and obscenely corrupt adversary, and this 112-year-old watchmaker, who is someone who's been part of Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army, and it becomes a very rich and complex and exciting novel, which I'm going to ask Ministry to talk more about. So that's by way of an introduction, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with them. And before we actually get down to the novels themselves, I'd like to just ask each of you, very quickly, the broadest question of all, but one that I think is something that preoccupies many people who come across a translation. What is it that motivates a translator? I know as a poet, I know what motivates me when I translate. It becomes for me a chance to actually engage with the resources of language. In that sense, it's a very sensuous, very messy process, which I enjoy. But it would be interesting if each of you were to talk about that. Would you like to go first?
Hi. Hello. For me, I came into translation by accident, but I've lived with, like many in my generation, Malayalis have a deep relationship, deep and a historical relationship with translations. Translations is embedded in our culture. We are intellectually, we've been intellectually, linguistically, culturally influenced by translations. So I've lived with translations and I had to give back. I have to do my bit to give back to translations. But more than that, personally, I think it is the play with languages which is important for me. I like the way languages collide, engage with each other, look at askance at each other, become helpless because you can't get, you agonize for days over one particular word. And that's why translation, it's an ongoing challenge, but it is a challenge from which you want to escape, but you can't. That's how I see translation.
Lovely. Ministry, I know that you have said that as an IAS officer, translation is a kind of meditation for you. Am I right?
Yes.
Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, as a bureaucrat, you're handling very tough, stressful work environment throughout the day. So translation is actually like a meditation, Your personality doesn't matter. You're a channel through which another person's words flow. So it's like a prayer, actually. I also got into translation by accident. In fact, I should thank translation for saving me from a very sad phase of my life. I wanted to get my mind away from the negativity I was facing in the work situation at that time. So I started by translating Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa's, philosophy. C. Rajagopalachari had written a book on the discourses of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa in Kalki magazine, and his daughter Lakshmi Gandhi translated it into Hindi. And a very depressing Deepavali, I ended up getting it. I translated it into Malayalam. And that is how, there's been a spiritual quotient always. And then I got into translating Avadhi, Sri Ramcharitamanas. I have translated 4 sopans as of today, 2 are under publication. And translating from Malayalam to English.
So does this mean you translate from Malayalam to English as well as into
Hindi,
Malayalam?
Yes, I just do it 3 ways except into Hindi. I translate from Hindi to Malayalam and English too. So again, an accidental foray, but I should just add on to one point which Fatima said. I think all 3 of us grew up reading world classics translated in Malayalam. I read Pratham Pradishruti and Bagul Katha and, all of that in Malayalam in high school. And I fell in love with Bengali literature like that. So it's been part of our growing up, and probably that we think trilingual half of the time, so it makes it easier.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Nandakumar?
You could say I wandered into translation because, thanks to Fatima, I read some of the extant translations which are available from Malayalam into English, and I kind of thought that, look, there should be a better way of putting across the thought, and that is when, I thought, why don't I take a look at what I can do, and thanks to her, I got a chance. So it worked out, and so it has been now going on.
Okay. Do you want to say something? I would ask this of each of you. Maybe you can start, Nandakumar, about what kind of work you've translated prior to this. And, what are the projects that have really excited you? What has been a particular learning experience for you?
Okay. Before we did Delhi or Soliloquy, as a child, when I read Kada Sarit Sagara, I always wanted to translate that into English. So somewhere in the early 2000s, I made an attempt of, maybe I did 300, 400 pages. But then I did not find a publisher at that time, so I just gave it up. After that, though the first published book is Delhi a Soliloquy, the first one I actually did was Indu Menon's short stories, The Lesbian Cow. So that was done first, but this got published first. So that's what
What about you?
Apart from, like I said, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, I translated Daniel Ladinsky's Love Poems of God.
Hafiz.
Yeah, 120 poems I picked up and translated into Malayalam
I
as
see.
Deivathinte Pranaya Geethangal. So DC Publications had published it. And then I did a couple of translations of Malayalam poetry into English. Veerankutti's Heaviness of the Rain.
Yes.
Yes. Then Aranyakant, Lankakant under publication. I had done Kishkindakant and Sundarkant. It's transliteration from Avadhi to English.
Yes.
So it's like a passion. I hope to complete the whole Sri Ramcharitamanas someday.
Yes.
And then KR Meera's works were the first two books from Malayalam to English.
Uh-huh.
The Poison of Love, Meera Sadhu,
Okay.
and Nethron Milanam as translated as The Unseeing Idol of Light, both published by Penguin Random House. Then I've translated 5 books of James. Hopefully it'll see light very soon. We are very eager to. The next book is coming next month,
I
in
see.
fact. Yes.
Okay.
So, and Sonia Rafiq's books, I'm working on Sonia Rafiq's books, a brilliant young writer. Yes.
I see.
Yeah.
So I'm particularly excited, of course, when you mention poetry, because I can imagine that the demands of fiction and poetry are quite different. And we'll come back to that. We must talk about that.
I too started off with poetry and microfiction, but most of them were uncredited, like how it is in the life of all translators. Then I started off, Nandan was with me, he helped me a lot with Profess when I was doing Profess. Then Profess was the first book which was published, and it was a complex kind of narrative because it was, I would call it a cultural quagmire, because it talks about 100 years of literary and cultural history of Malayalam and Keralites. And, it was like a mnemonic, asking them to remember everything. So it required a glossary, an extensive glossary as well, which was appended to the book. Then came Gracie's short stories, which was published, like in the case of Nandan, it was published after Delhi, but it took a long time, and it was a difficult one in the sense that it required you to constantly, redefine feminist positions which were changing, because we are talking about stories which ran into 30 years of a career. So it was, it was about her changing positions which would be reflected in the stories as well, and a lot of difficulties regarding sudden tense shifts and tonal variations and incomplete sentences which which are meaningful in Malayalam, but it is difficult to transfer into English. So, but each one was a learning curve.
Yes. In fact, Fatima, we'll continue with you if we may. What was it really that drew you to this particular novel? How did this process begin?
Some books actually come to us.
Yes.
Some
Does it
we
come
go after.
from, no, so are you talking in a more mystical sense?
No,
or do you mean from the
not
publisher?
really, in a very practical, materialistic sense. Because after the Profess, on the day the Profess was released in Kerala, Mukundan was there. Mukundan is also from my place, Mahi. I come from Mahi. So he asked me whether he and his friend came along and said that he's interested in getting Delhi translated, because this is a very dear to him. So, but I couldn't take it up for a long time. I was boggled down by a lot of academic duties and things like that. So it's only when Nandan came along with me and offered to do the first draft that the project actually took off. So I talked to Mukundan. Mukundan was all right, was happy that, happy to have Nandan along, and it continued that way.
Yes, but that actually brings me to a question I'd like to ask both of you before we move on to Anti-Clock. How does it work when two people are working on the same translation? I mean, what is the process? Does one call the shots? Are there subtle tensions that you'd like to now divulge?
We gel very well in our choice of words, choice of phrases. So there was hardly anything where we differed, except that she thought it should be cut down. The length was too this thing. I said, no, this is a whole book. I mean, if the author, you are a translator, you don't edit it. So
I
no
didn't want to. I wanted Mukundan to edit it so that it wouldn't be so, some parts were too lengthy, I felt, because it was written at a time when, Delhi was being explained to people back home, Malayalis back home.
But
So certain
see,
things.
there is a difference there. I have lived in Delhi from 1982 onwards. But there are parts of Delhi even which I didn't know it's there in the book.
Yeah.
So that argument I couldn't stomach. So anyway, that was the only point of difference. And then since the first draft was done, she
Yeah.
did the rest of it. And
So it's like you did the entire draft?
Yes.
Or is it that you alternated?
No.
No.
He did the first
I
draft.
I
and
see.
Then I worked with Mukundan and did the reworking.
So it becomes an animated email exchange?
yes, for WhatsApp calls.
WhatsApp for a novel of this length?
Yeah, but we're quite conversant with each other's styles, and we know our strengths and weaknesses because we've collaborated unofficially on different projects. So we are quite familiar with each other. We agree to disagree. Of course, we have a lot of disagreements, but then but if it is for the good of the book, we tend to agree more.
Okay. But I'm going to ask each of you about what the challenges were, because clearly this was a rewarding process, but there had to have been challenges. While you think up some possible challenges, I'm going to move to Ministry. And what drew you to this work?
In fact, some books literally leap off in a spiritual sense also and reach you. So the first book of James, which, because whenever I visit Kerala, I go to the bookstores and, that is what I do, the typical, I love the smell of books, So, Book of Exodus, Purapadinte Pusthakam was the first book which literally left off the steps. I said, who is this author? Okay, because I'm working in another state. So, it's very difficult sometimes to keep updated with literature. When you're in the state, I think it helps a lot more.
Where do you live, Ministry?
I'm in Lucknow.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm based in Lucknow. So I love the book. It was then I read the foreword that it took him 12 years to complete the book and the struggles as an author. But it's a beautiful book, although it's a very depressing one. I should tell James, you should not write such sad books, So I just loved it. So his email ID was there. So I reached out and said, I really love this book. Would you mind if I translate it? I've translated 2 of KR Meera's book. Immediately he responded, be wonderful. I'm very happy that, So we completed this book, Book of Exodus, somewhere near 2018, latter part of 2018. But then both of us were very busy with our own professional. He's a scientist in VSSC, Vikram Sarabhai Space Center, and I was also very caught up in work and some other projects. So we didn't push it too hard for the publication. And then later, I got busy with some other project, it didn't work out. And the end of 2019, I went back and said, maybe we should try to push this book, And then publication offers were not forthcoming because probably the book was written like 20, 30 years before. Then we started working on anti-clock because then I started getting other books. We just loved this writing style. Then we sent it out to a lit agent, we started working on the 3rd book. So by the time we got an offer from Penguin for 3-4 books, we had completed a whole series. So just did it for the love of it. So there is a spiritual connect here.
That is. I think that's really the best possible way for a translation to happen. When you actually fall in love with the text and serendipitously discover this book and get in touch with the writer. That's very special. But I'm going to ask each of you, I think it would be lovely to actually get a sense of the text. But perhaps the right way to lead up to that would be if you also talked a little about what the actual challenges were when you're transposing a text from one language to the other. What are I know much of it is actually about rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty in a language, That's what it is, really. And that's when you discover all the obstacles, all the reasons why, all the untranslatable areas. So it would be interesting if each of you talked about those and then maybe read a section. Fatima.
Compared to the other novels that both of us have translated, I think this was fairly straightforward. It was deliberately simple. So for us to maintain that simplicity and also, ensure that there is a thread of an elegiac tone which is running through the novel. So we had to ensure that the tone is not sundered in any way, spoiled in any way. Then we also had, it comes also with very simple narration, but it also, because it is a novel which is a witness narrative, a kind of a witness narrative. So when it is a witness narrative and you're talking about people who are impacted by the horrible turns in history, and when they're looking at history unraveling around them and the world falling apart around them, you have to ensure that you are speaking you are also translating with empathy, because this is narrated with empathy. You have to ensure that the empathetic subjectivity is not spoiled in any way by the translators. And there are quirky humor and dark, poignant humor, quirky ways of phrasing, some darkness at some points, and typical of Keralites, because we are deeply political. There are a lot of political resonances which are also there. So we had to ensure all that, but otherwise it was a very straightforward narrative.
Is humor particularly difficult to translate? Is humor the most difficult thing to carry from one context into another, or not really?
Not really. Not
Would
really.
you read something, Fatima? It would be lovely.
Like to.
Yes, while you respond.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
No, see, like she said, Mukundan himself has said that this is a novel written about common people, for the common people. So there are no flourishes, which Shashi Tharoor, when he was releasing the book, said, there are no flourishes in this book. There are no flourishes in this book. So very straightforward and very simple language. There were linguistically absolutely no challenges in this particular book. I mean, if you take Indu Menon's stories, this was a walk in the park actually. So no issues at all.
Okay.
There is typically a section which makes us Malayalis, and politics. The first part of the book is about the main speaker is Sahadevan, the speaking voice, and his mentor Sridhar Nunni dies of heartbreak when China invades. So it is from part 1, Times of War, and second chapter, Writing in Times of War. So Sridhar Nunni, who is a staunch Marxist, who believed that Hindi Chini bye bye would go on and 100 flowers would bloom, suddenly is absolutely broken when he hears that China has invaded India. So Sahadevan, who is standing in front of the photo of Zhao Enlai, which was God to Sridhar Nunni, is speaking when paying homage to his friend. So, Comrade Zhao Enlai, why have you done this terrible thing? We have an inexhaustible list of gods we can call upon. We have Guruvayurappan and Ayyappan at Shabarimala. We have Paramashivan, Subramanya Swami and Vigneshwaran. We have Parashinikadavu Muttappan, Kadambura Bhagavadi, Muchilotu Bhagavadi and Koyodan Koroth Sastappan. Vishnumurti, Gandhakarnan, Karingkuttichatan and Guligan are present in the countless shrines and sacred groves from Kasarkot to Vadagara. Despite that, it's your photo that Sridhar Nunni chose to hang on his wall, and yet you betrayed him. Why, Zhao Enlai? Still muttering to himself, Sahadevan stood in front of the photo.
Mm-hmm. Ministry, would you like to talk a little about what the challenges were with this particular book?
Yes, Arundhathi. See, this book was very challenging. One, it is based, it's a life of a coffin maker. How many of us have ever, known a coffin maker? So James apparently researched and studied. But Henry is a coffin maker with a difference. He's a very erudite guy, although he has failed the 10th standard twice. Now, this is exactly what you call a cultural trope. You will actually end up finding auto rickshaw drivers or, vada makers or whoever who are actually well versed with Malayalam literature. So Henry can speak about short stories, he can speak about Pinkala Keshini, the death of Tarashankar Banerjee. I mean, why? Because this is not something which you will find in any other book. A 10th standard field, you don't expect him to know a Bengali classical literature, right? But the Vayanashala, the reading culture, nobody will question it in the original Malayalam. You'll just assume, okay, Henry went to the nearby Vayanashala and, read that book. Now, how do you communicate that sense? So sometimes you add a footnote, sometimes you add an explanation in the text. Very challenging to convince a non-Malayali author that a coffee maker can know world literature. There's a lot of literal references and allusions all over the text. So that was very challenging. Part 2, the biblical context. The ostiapam, or the sacramental bread. I'm not a Christian. So I sat with the missionary sisters. I asked them, questions. James helped me because I couldn't afford to get anything wrong. There is an Indriyapam made during Easter. These are typical Catholic rites. And I just could not afford to get any mistakes. So I had to pour over the Bible, talk a lot, check out. There is a session on, reassembling a clarinet. I watched an entire video. I mean, what is reassemble first? Why do you moisten the reed? You just can't afford to get it wrong. So it is actually backbreaking work.
In fact, I remember reading this interview, Ministry, where you said that you had your research extended from Advaita and physics to the history of the Communist Party in Kerala, the flora and fauna of Kerala, all of this and more.
Because Pandit is explaining deep philosophy and science to a coffee maker.
Yes.
Very sensible, clear language.
Yes.
Wonderfully, deceptively simple language in Malayalam. Now, simplicity is the greatest challenge for an English translator. How do you capture that sense of humility?
In fact, there's a particular image that I think James himself uses. This was originally thought of as a short story, am I right? So he has this lovely image of the fisherman sitting and trying to catch fish with a fishing rod. He says that's the short story. Whereas the novel is about casting your nets wide and hoping to catch as many fish as possible, which was a very evocative image. And I wondered what the translator's challenge would be, or what image you would use to describe the translator's approach to this. Is there a fishing metaphor?
I mean, it's absolutely fine for him. It's a very focused effort and novel because, to get the voice is the challenge. And when the first sentence, a steady voice should continue until the 320th page. And, I cannot let down the beauty of a book. So to catch the voice, probably when you said, how does certain books appeal, you're confident as a translator that the voice is there, clear and steady in your head,
Would you read something
Yes,
from
I
it?
will.
Yeah?
In fact, I would like to read about the erudite Henry referring to Pingala Keshini and Tarashankar, which will tell you the challenge as a translator. So this is a chapter called Amma, in which, he gets mentally disturbed after her death, and his father takes him to a Vaidyan, a Nadi Vaidyan, typically like Jivan Mashai. Anyway, when Appin took me to Kani Vaidyan, not only did I not resist the treatment, but I also relished it thoroughly. I liked the look of that slim, calm, amusing man. At first glance, I thought Jivan Mashai of Arogya Niketanam had come alive. So we gave a footnote. So we said Tarashankar Banerjee's Bangla novel, Arogya Niketan, was translated into Malayalam as Arogya Niketanam, and Jivan Mashai is an eponymous healer in the book, which we would not have given in the original Malayalam. So that is how we play around to make it accessible. Right. The Vaidyan checked my pulse and deduced my inner and outer states. When he suggested that I stay a week with him, enjoying oil massages and hot baths, I readily agreed. When I first read Arogya Niketanam from the library of Adi Nadu, Jivan Mashai was just an imaginary healer in my mind. I thought that the way he diagnosed diseases by checking the pulse was merely a figment of Tarashankar Banerjee's imagination. Was a disease screaming out its name while coursing through the bloodstream that someone could read it with a touch? My mind scoffed at the thought.
We will be throwing this open to questions from the audience in a while, but before that, I wanted to ask all of you, there's a line by the poet and translator of Kabir, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. It's deliberately a provocative line, I think, but it's an interesting one. He says that for a translator, the original is often an impediment that needs to be overcome. It's almost a roadblock. And I think it's very clearly an overstatement, but it does point to something quite true, which is the fact that, on the one hand, the original is an inspiration, but in the actual process of translation, there are times when the original can seem like something, if not to be improved upon, certainly something that you want freedom from as well. So I wondered if you'd like to respond to that with regard to this particular work.
In Malayalam, we don't have too many editors who go through the manuscripts. So having Nandan on board is like having an editor and a researcher combined. So he's the one who will find, differences in if sometimes scream is wrong or certain facts are wrong, etc. So in that sense, all the impediments will be covered by in translation. And the authors are also quite open to that. In their next editions, they will ensure that even though they may not have editors, they are self-editors. So they will ensure that in the Malayalam version, those changes would also be incorporated. In that sense, I think we are also doing our bit as translator editors. Other than that, I think we constantly talk about, fidelity to the. It's an issue which is constantly talked about. Constantly, we get even now, I can't understand after talking about so many years about fidelity, so many centuries about fidelity and loss and gain, we are still talking about it. And we've gained whatever we can from translation. And translations have made us. But for translations, we would be sequestered in lonely linguistic suburbs. And we would never be able to, we would be totally mired in mutual cultural incomprehension. So since we've gained so much, I don't think there is any point in showing, waxing eloquent about, too eloquent about fidelity. If we are to show too much of fidelity, this is what I feel, it would be a labored translation.
But it also strikes me, Fatima, that of course, A.K. Mehrotra was lucky or perhaps unlucky, that's debatable. Kabir is no longer around.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to actually be translating the work of a live author? In addition to the conversations you've had, I'm assuming there's also the looming presence of the author.
Yeah, but if the author is open to, he wants it to be translated well, he wants the novel to resonate across and to be carried over to other readers, I'm sure that the authors will be called. We've never had any difficulty with any of our authors for that matter. I'm sure even Nandan's case, it's the same. Mukundan was all along with, he was with us all along. And he was open to any changes, anything that we said. He never interfered as such. And we work very closely with both of us. Even though I may speak about fidelity in a negative manner, we worked very closely. We work very closely with the author. So, yeah.
I'm reminded of this thing of when the first draft was shared with him, Mukundan had an issue with 3 words, just 3 words. One was petrichor. So I said, Mukundan, that is the word, please. He said, no, Nandan, people may not understand that word, when they read this thing. I said, no. But he let us proceed with that. Second was, I had written, there's a passage where it was Hessian, this thing. I said, I had written Hessian tent or something like. He said, no, let us use Gunny because that is more, That was the only intervention that was coming from his side. When I did the book, 1,000 Cuts, he's a Malayalam professor. So he had his own, this thing. There again, if you explain, look, this will read this way better in English. This is the idiom in English. Generally, I have found authors very, very receptive. Nobody has said no, can't do. They understand that, there is a difference between Malayalam and English. And if this reads better in, this way in English, they agree to that, this thing. And the other thing is that, we differ in that. This thing is that, you have to be faithful to the author because it is his word. You don't take it and then, turn it around. So when I do a translation, I try to be very, very, as close as possible to the original words. I don't, this thing. And the satisfaction comes in when the author says, look, yeah, this is what I meant. That is when you feel good, they agree, yes, this is exactly what we had.
You know, she mentioned that you almost played the role of the editor through this process, but you also said that there were sections you thought of cutting out. Did you, and you were not too keen on cutting them out?
No, see, what happened was, it's a lengthy novel. It's about 170,000 words, if I remember correctly. So, like she said, there are parts when Delhi is described. But with the knowledge that I had that, okay, I have not seen all of Delhi, and everybody who's seen in Delhi wouldn't have seen the parts which Mukundan has seen. In fact, when we were doing the editing of the book, one of the copy editors said, how can this be possible? Because Mukundan has said after Andrews Ganj, it is all cabbage patches and wheat fields. She said, no, that's not possible. So we had to intervene.
She was young.
Young. So that way, there are things which the younger generation doesn't know what he has written about. So what is the point in removing? And there was certain religiously sensitive part which he thought in the current, dispensation, it may not do this thing. But luckily for us, our editor Karthika, she said, no, we will not cut out anything. So I had the editor on my side, not on their side.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, but we actually, Mukundan also agreed on cutting down initially, because we were not talking about those kind of passages. We were actually looking at too many nostalgic narrations, which, did not seem to resonate at this, it was written long ago. So for the contemporary reader, it may not, we both felt that it may not resonate well, and the size of the book may turn the reader away from the book.
Yes.
So that was also a worry on the part of Mukundan. So Mukundan wanted to cut. I didn't want to cut.
Okay.
Mukundan was intending to cut. Finally, when Nandan and editor said, and the editor said that we don't need to go ahead with that,
He was fine with it.
He was fine with it.
Ministry, what about you? This whole dance that I think translators have to perform between fidelity to the original, freedom from the original. How does that work?
I think it starts with a implicit trust between you and the author. You cannot work with an author who doesn't trust you as a translator. I've had some bitter experiences, so it will also add to your last question, whether the silent service is all the time good for the translator. It need not be. We suffer our pangs as well. Sometimes you're simply taken for granted and your hours of toil are just, But I've been very fortunate. See, one thing is clarity in the author. James as an author, he is absolutely clear why he wrote that sentence, why that comma is there. That clarity helps you. Because, then if you, for example, paraphrase the paragraph rather than literally translate it, and the author says, no, Mini, put it in the active voice. It's very, very good. So I think how we work is we do intense joint editing of every sentence. That's again part of the backbreaking work. Before it is submitted to the publisher, we probably do 2 to 3 rounds of joint editing together, so that we have one voice by the time the feedback comes from the publisher. So that makes our job, So that way we try to be faithful to the text. But then at the end of the day, like they said with Mukundan sir, James gives total freedom. At the end of the day, he says, it's just my suggestion. It's up to you. Because certain words like, he said petrico, in the same way we also fight. So, translators also pick up, I had this habit of writing down all this new words which I find in the book I'm translating. So the next book is like dotted. And James says, isn't it too complicated? Can't you simplify it? And no, it's my baby, my word,
Yes. So that's...
But then he respects it. He said, finally, okay, keep your baby. So it does not matter.
Okay. So we are going to throw this open to questions. So if there are questions in the audience, Thomas and more. Yes, we'll start with you.
Good morning, everyone. I am A.J. Thomas. I also translate fiction and poetry and drama from Malayalam. My question is generally to the three of you, and it's not for me, the answer is not for me, it's for the audience. It's a very technical thing.
Could you just
You can't hear it?
Hold the mic.
Okay. Yeah, the question is, this is for the audience, not for me, the answer. You see, what do you do with linguistic and cultural terms when you come across them? You can't make footnotes, it's not done nowadays, but what do you do to incorporate the essence of the cultural or linguistic term in the text?
Yeah. See, if there are things which need a little bit of addition, I add it in the text itself to make it clear that this is, so instead of making it to a footnote, because like he said, it's frowned upon now. I mean, when we started Delhi, I had about, 200 footnotes. Karthika said not one of them, maybe 3 of them remained finally. So that was about historical people. When you say AKG, non-Malayali will not understand who is AKG. So those few things we had to retain. But that context is provided within the text. That's what the style I do.
Nowadays, the editors are pretty, encouraging. So we usually put footnotes, but then they say why. I mean, if somebody is curious about that term, they'll Google. For example, Taravada. It's a very typical that Malayali, Nayar, that family, this thing. So I gave a footnote. The editor said there's no need, Taravada is something which you can find. Communist pacha. Literally the word, the weed which grows like communism, all across. So I had actually translated, Googled and found the English, and then there was no need. So sometimes editors take that sort of a view. Sometimes you work it as a part of the text. So that's what we do.
Do you want to say something, Fathima?
Yeah, more or less what they've said. Some words we retain, some we hope that the readers will find on their own, like how we found when we were reading translations from other languages. So like words like Kindle, words like... but we do, for the first time it occurs, we do write a bit so that it will be clearer to the reader, and the reader will find. And synonyms also, you add synonym of that particular word so that next time the word comes, the Malayalam word comes, they will remember the synonym. Like how we all read translations.
I know. I do feel in some ways that is an advantage with fiction. It's actually possible in prose to bring in this kind of context. With poetry, which is such a distilled form, it's a very difficult thing to arrive at. I know there are several questions. Yes, please.
I live in Delhi, and first time I came to Delhi was in 1973. And before I came to Delhi, I read the book Mukundan's Delhi, and that was my introduction to Delhi. And I am very glad that you have not deleted any portion from it. Thank you.
No, by the way, that book which you read is not what we have translated, because he wrote a book called Delhi. Then he wrote a book called Delhi Gathakal, which is what we have translated, okay? But, I mean, essentially, it is...
It's good to hear that from a reader, though. Yes.
Good morning, and thank you so much for taking the Malayalam to the world audience by your translations. I have a question. I know that you don't change the narrative, theme, plot, anything of the book, but I want to know what happens in your head when you translate, when you read a book so closely and keenly. Do you think that maybe this character can have a different shade? What about the end could have been like, something different? Do you create a story of your own out of the book which you're reading and translating? I really wanted to know what happens in your head. Completely maybe, totally different from what is it in the writer's head. Thank you so much.
Exactly, we do imagine we do imagine other narratives along while we are translating. We do imagine a different future for the characters. We do that, but we, as translators, we are well aware that we are dealing with someone else's work. Constantly that weight of responsibility is always there. So what happens is that, the only thing that I can talk about what the translator's experience has been captured by an anonymous Chinese proverb saying the translator is someone who dances in chains. Exactly.
From my perspective, it starts off, like I said, it's a form of meditation. You cannot afford to have an ego. You're not there, That is why it's like a prayer. You're a channel, and it's a very creative process. So, and you can't just translate. I mean, sometimes, certain days, James sometimes used to say, Minnie, yesterday you were in a good mood. What a beautiful flow of translation. Today, maybe you had some fight with the boss or something, because, so
it's
the
that
channel,
intimate a process,
so that's
really.
a challenge.
I know that we've almost run out of time. Would you like to say something, Nandakumar?
No, I have already said my piece that I hew very close to the author. I probably, if I had a creative bone in my body, I would have written a book myself. I don't have one. So I translate.
Okay, on that note, I must say that the books are available. Do go out and get them. But I also would like to invite you all to give a very special round of applause to translators, because they are They're truly the invisible presence. And I do think that, Ministry calls it the silent service to literature that translators perform. Sometimes I think that service can be far too silent. So the last round of applause for the translator. Thank you all.